The heat in northern Arizona doesn't just beat down on you. It presses in from all sides, a physical weight that smothers thought. It was the summer of 1962, and the air itself seemed to vibrate, a shimmering curtain between me and the blood-red mesas that clawed at a bleached blue sky. Every breath was a mouthful of dust, and the bitter, clean scent of sun-baked sagebrush. My starched collar, a relic of my life back at Columbia University, was a damp ring of misery around my neck. This was my first major field expedition as a lead anthropologist, and I, Dr. Arthur Coleman, felt less like a scholar on the cusp of discovery and more like a man slowly being cooked alive. Our camp was a small, temporary scar on an eternal landscape. Canvas tents, a generator that sputtered with the wheezing cough of a dying man, and a long trestle table where we sorted pottery shards under a flapping tarp that offered more noise than shade. This was the site of a newly discovered ancestral Puebloan settlement, tucked into the protective crook of a nameless canyon. The grant was international, the expectations high, and the sun relentless. Find anything more exciting than a potsherd shaped like the state of Idaho, Arthur? The voice belonged to Dr. Frank Miller, a man whose reputation preceded him by a good 20 years and a dozen publications. Frank, from the University of Chicago, was built like a retired prize fighter, with a thick neck and a face tanned to the consistency of old leather. He saw this dig not as a puzzle to be solved, but a mountain to be conquered, its peak planted with the flag of his name. He gestured with a chipped ceramic mug toward my sorting tray. "Just the usual, Frank," I said, nudging a piece of corrugated grayware with the tip of a brush. "Utility pieces." Seems this was the kitchen and garbage dump of the settlement. "The kitchen is where the heart is," he boomed, a grin splitting his face. "But I'm not here for the heart. I'm here for the head, the ceremonial center. I'm telling you, Arthur, these people weren't an offshoot of the Mesa Verde or Chaco cultures. They were something else, something unique. Find me a burial chamber that proves it, and the cover of archaeology today is ours." He spoke of fame like it was a tangible artifact one could dig from the earth. A third voice, softer and more measured, joined us. Or perhaps the story isn't in their bones, but in their words. Dr. Eleanor Hayes from Berkeley sat at the far end of the table, her fingers tracing the faded black lines on a piece of pottery. Her hat cast a deep shadow over her face, but I could see the intense focus in her eyes. Eleanor was our philologist, a specialist in petroglyphs and ancient symbol systems. Where Frank saw artifacts, she saw a library. "Look at this," she said, holding the shard up. "These cross-hatchings, the spirals, we call them decorative, but that's a failure of our imagination. This isn't just a pattern, it's a phrase, a sentence. We've just forgotten the language." Frank grunted, a sound of dismissive affection. "You and your glyphs, Eleanor. Give me a unique skull formation or an undiscovered burial rite any day, something you can measure and photograph." The dynamic was set. Frank, the pragmatist, Eleanor, the intuitive, and me, the rationalist, caught in the middle, trying to build a cohesive picture from the scattered pieces they championed. Our crew was supplemented by a half-dozen local men from the Navajo reservation. They were good workers, quiet and efficient, their hands moving with a practiced economy as they sifted the dry soil. They spoke to each other in their own tongue, a language of soft consonants and flowing tones that seemed more a part of the wind than of human speech. But a strange thing happened whenever one of us, Frank, Eleanor, or myself, approached. The conversation would die instantly. They would nod, answer our questions in clipped English, and then fall back into a profound, watchful silence. It wasn't hostility. It was something deeper. A barrier we didn't have the tools to excavate. I was working with a young Navajo student, Ben So, who acted as our unofficial liaison. He was bright, attending Arizona State, and straddled the two worlds with an awkward grace. "Why so quiet?" I asked him one afternoon, gesturing to the silent men breaking for water. "Is it something we've done?" Ben wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. "No, Dr. Coleman. It is not you. It is this place. The old stories. They say this ground remembers. Not all memories are good. I, of course, filed this away as fascinating cultural context, a piece of folklore to be included in my field notes. The Puebloans vanished from this region 700 years ago. The Navajo arrived centuries later. Whatever memories the ground held, they were hardly their own. It was a rational, academic explanation. It was also completely wrong. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of digging, sifting, and cataloging under the oppressive glare of the sun. The generator would fail. The water truck would be late. Frank would grow more impatient, his desire for a groundbreaking find souring his mood. Eleanor would spend hours staring at a single symbol, lost in a world 7 centuries dead. And the Navajo workers would watch us, their dark eyes holding a knowledge that felt as ancient and unreadable as the canyon walls. The heat was a constant, a suffocating blanket that seemed to want to press us into the very dust we were sifting, to make us part of the silent, forgotten history of this place. We thought we were the ones asking the questions, but the land itself seemed to be waiting, listening for an answer we didn't know we were supposed to give. The second week of the dig was a study in diminishing returns. The sun seemed to have found a new, more personal animosity toward us, baking the clay pan until it cracked in a spiderweb of fissures across the valley floor. We were unearthing an endless supply of broken cooking pots, worn grinding stones, and the occasional bone awl. It was important work, the kind that builds the foundation of an academic paper, but it lacked the thrill of discovery Frank so desperately craved. He had taken to pacing the edge of the excavation pits, muttering about funding and wasted time. "It's like they just packed a bag and left," he grumbled, kicking at a loose rock. "No signs of conflict, no mass graves, just gone. How does a whole culture just walk away from their homes?" "Maybe they knew it was time to leave," Eleanor said quietly from her station, not looking up from a collection of shards she was trying to piece together. "Maybe the land told them to." I was in Pit 3, a section near the base of the canyon wall that seemed to have been a refuse area. The work was tedious, scraping away layers of compacted soil and ash, centimeter by centimeter. The air was still and thick with the ghosts of ancient fires. It was there, about 4 feet down in a layer of dark, charcoal-flecked earth, that my trowel struck something with a dull thud. It wasn't the sharp clink of stone or the hollow sound of pottery. It was dense, solid. Carefully, I widened the area, my heart beginning a low, hopeful drumbeat against my ribs. Using a soft brush, I whisked away the loose dirt. It was a tablet, or perhaps a large, deliberately flattened stone, about the size of a dinner plate. It was made of fired clay, but its color was a strange, deep ochre, unlike the typical gray and tan ware of the region. And then I saw the markings. My breath caught. They were pictographs, but they were utterly alien. The art of the ancestral Puebloans, for all its regional variations, possessed a certain flow, a harmony. Their lines were curved, their figures often abstract but balanced. These were different. They were all sharp angles and aggressive slashes. A stick-like figure of a man was depicted, but with its limbs bent at impossible angles, its head thrown back in a silent scream. Next to it was a symbol that looked like a jawbone, filled with serrated triangular teeth. The central figure was a spiral, but unlike the common symbol for the sun or the journey of life, this one coiled inward toward a jagged, star-like shape that seemed to radiate not light but violence. It felt less like art and more like a warning. "Frank, Eleanor," I called out, my voice tight. "You need to see this." They were at my side in a moment. Frank let out a low whistle, crouching down to get a better look. "Well, I'll be damned. That's not Anasazi, not Hohokam. I've never seen anything like it." His frustration had vanished, replaced by the electric buzz of discovery. "This is it, Arthur. This is our unique branch." But Eleanor was silent. She stared at the tablet, her brow furrowed. She reached out a hand as if to touch it, then hesitated, pulling back. "There's a syntax to it," she whispered, more to herself than to us. "It's aggressive, predatory. The other pottery, it speaks of corn, of rain, of community. This speaks of hunger." The word hung in the hot, still air. Hunger. It was a strange, visceral word to use for a set of carved lines, but as I looked at them again, I knew she was right. There was a desperate, grasping quality to the images, a story of something that was never satisfied. As I worked to carefully excavate the tablet, I noticed a change at the edge of the pit. The usual quiet hum of the Navajo workers had ceased. They were standing in a loose group, watching me, their faces unreadable masks. The silence was different now. It wasn't just respectful distance. It was heavy, thick with a palpable unease. Even Ben So, my usually talkative student assistant, was standing stiffly, his arms crossed over his chest. Later that day, after the tablet had been cleaned, photographed, and laid carefully on a velvet cloth in the main tent, Ben approached me. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard. "Dr. Coleman," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ben, what is it? You looked like you'd seen a ghost this afternoon." He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the tent where the tablet lay. "My grandfather, my mother's father. He was a singer, a medicine man. When I was a boy, he told me stories to keep me from wandering off into the mesas at night." He took a deep breath. "He told me about signs like that, carved on rocks deep in the forbidden canyons. He said they were left by the old ones, the Anasazi, to mark places where a great evil had happened." "An evil?" I asked, my scientific mind immediately classifying this as valuable ethnographic data. "What kind of evil?" Ben's gaze was dark and serious. He called them the signs of the long stomach, the signs of a hunger that could not be filled, a hunger that would devour a man from the inside out, make him turn on his own kind. He said that if you ever find a sign like that— He paused, his voice dropping even lower. "You do not dig it up. You cover it. You walk away. You let the earth forget." He looked at me, his young face etched with a fear that went far beyond simple superstition. "My grandfather said that some things are buried for a reason, and that hunger, it is a patient thing. It can sleep for a very long time." He turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me alone in the fading light, the arid wind suddenly feeling cold against my skin. Frank saw the tablet as a key to fame. Eleanor saw a dark language. But Ben So, he saw a gravestone, and I had just dug it up. Just dug it. 2 days after the discovery of the tablet, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. moving with a slow, determined purpose toward our camp. Vehicles were a rare sight out here, usually just our weekly water and supply truck from Flagstaff. This was something different. An ancient Ford pickup, its original color lost to decades of sun and rust, rattled to a stop near our main tent. The engine died with a shuddering gasp, and a man emerged from the driver's side. He was Navajo, but he carried himself differently than our workers. While they were reserved, he was still, with an unnerving, predatory stillness. He was tall and lean, his face a roadmap of sharp angles and deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. He wore a dusty black hat and a silver belt buckle in the shape of a coiled snake. He didn't speak, just stood by his truck, surveying our camp with a look that was neither curious nor hostile but possessive, as if he were appraising his own property. Frank, ever the camp commander, strode out to meet him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone brusque. The man's eyes shifted to Frank, and for the first time I felt a genuine prickle of unease. His gaze was unnervingly direct. "I hear you are looking for old things," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You are digging for stories in the dust, but you are digging in the wrong place." "And I suppose you know the right one," Frank retorted, crossing his arms. "I do," the man said simply. He introduced himself as Joseph Begay. He said he had heard in town about the university folks digging out in the wastes. He told us a story his grandfather had told him of a tomb hidden in a place called Tse Bihinda Deestwin, the Canyon of the Painted Shadows. A place, he said, that was not for the living. He claimed it was the burial site of a great chief from a forgotten clan, a sorcerer king who was buried with treasures unlike any seen before. A place untouched by time, untouched by grave robbers, because the local people feared it too much to even speak its name. "It's a tomb no white man has ever seen," Begay finished, his eyes gleaming. "I can take you there." Frank's cynicism melted away, replaced by the hot glow of ambition. This was it. The motherlode. An untouched, high-status burial. "What's the catch?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion and excitement. "No catch," Begay said, though the slight smile on his lips said otherwise. "A guide's fee. $5,000. Half now, half when you are standing at the entrance." The sum was astronomical, a huge chunk of our discretionary budget. I started to protest, but Frank shot me a look that could have chipped stone. "We'll have to discuss it," he said to Begay. "Discuss," Begay said with a shrug. "I will wait." He leaned against the hot metal of his truck, perfectly at ease, as if he had all the time in the world. The argument in the main tent was immediate and fierce. "It's a scam, Frank," I insisted. "He hears about a big university grant and shows up with a fairy tale to fleece us." "Or," Frank countered, his voice rising, "he's telling the truth, and we're about to make the single greatest discovery in the history of southwestern archaeology. Think of it, Arthur. An intact pre-Columbian royal tomb. This is what we came here for." Eleanor, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "There's something wrong with him," she said, her gaze directed out the tent flap toward Begay. "It's not just about money. When he looks at you, he's not seeing a person. He's weighing something." Her words resonated with the unease I felt, but Frank was too far gone, his mind already composing the headlines. The debate raged for an hour, but the outcome was never in doubt. Frank's ambition was a force of nature. He would mortgage his house for a chance like this. We agreed. As I walked out to deliver the news and the first payment, Ben Tso intercepted me, grabbing my arm. His face was pale, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "Dr. Coleman, you cannot do this," he pleaded in a desperate whisper. "You cannot go with that man. Ben, it's a calculated risk." "No," he cut me off. "You do not understand." "His name is Begay. His family. They have a bad history. My grandfather said they were cast out from their clan generations ago. They were said to walk the witchery way, to practice the forbidden path." He leaned closer, his voice trembling. "Ansi, the corpse poison. They say his ancestors knew the dark ceremonies, that they could twist life, steal it from others." He glanced nervously toward the silent figure by the truck. "He is not looking for a tomb for you, Dr. Coleman. He has been looking for it for himself. People in my village say he searches for power, for things that were meant to stay buried. Please, do not follow him. That money is not for passage. It is for a key. And you do not want to see the door it unlocks." His warning was so earnest, so filled with a primal terror, that my scientific skepticism wavered. I looked from Ben's terrified face to Frank's triumphant one, and then to Joseph Begay, who watched us with an unnerving, knowing patience. The gambler in Frank had already thrown the dice. The scholar in me was intrigued by a puzzle. The intuitionist in Eleanor was sounding a silent alarm. And I, the rationalist, ignored the frantic warnings of a young man raised on superstition, because the allure of a mystery, the promise of a story hidden for 1,000 years, was simply too strong to resist. We shook hands with Joseph Begay and sealed our fate. Our decision to follow Begay was met with a wall of silent, absolute refusal. When Frank announced the new expedition to our Navajo workers, offering a generous bonus for a few more days of work, not a single man stepped forward. He doubled the offer. Still nothing. The crew's foreman, an older man named Hosteen Yazzie, finally spoke for the group. His English was deliberate, each word chosen with care. "We will not go to that place, Dr. Miller," he said, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Frank's shoulder. "That is the Canyon of the Painted Shadows. It is a place the holy people turned their backs on." "It's just a name, Hosteen," Frank said, his voice tight with frustration. "Just rocks and sand, like any other canyon." Yazzie shook his head slowly. "No, not like any other. They buried him there. Ye Nal Lushi." He spoke the name in a low, hushed tone, and a ripple of unease went through the other men. "The one who walks in another's skin. To go near that place is to invite sickness into your spirit. To disturb that ground, it is to let a great evil out into the world. No amount of money is worth that." Their refusal was non-negotiable. They packed their tools, collected their wages for the work done, and were gone within the hour, leaving our camp feeling hollow and strangely vulnerable. Ben So was the last to leave. He simply looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear, and said, "Be careful, Dr. Coleman." Then he too was gone. So it was just the three of us, Arthur, Frank, and Eleanor, and our silent, enigmatic guide. Begay seemed unsurprised, even pleased by the departure of the crew. He arranged for 2 young men from a border town, rough-looking types who would do anything for $100 a day, to come and work as our camp hands and laborers. They arrived in a beaten-up pickup, their laughter loud and out of place in the vast silence. We set out the next morning. Begay led the way in his ancient Ford, and we followed in our university Jeep. The journey took us away from the graded dirt roads and into the true wilderness, a labyrinth of red rock and dry washes. The landscape began to change, subtly at first, then dramatically. The hardy sagebrush and juniper trees grew sparse, then disappeared entirely, replaced by skeletal, thorny bushes and a type of pale, sickly-looking lichen that clung to the rocks. The canyon walls around us grew taller, more angular, their iron-rich surfaces streaked with black and purple mineral deposits that looked like old, dried blood. The very air seemed thinner, the silence more profound. By late afternoon, Begay stopped his truck at the mouth of a narrow, foreboding canyon. Looming over us was a single, colossal mesa, darker than the surrounding rock, its flat top cutting a severe line against the sky. It stood alone, a grim sentinel guarding the entrance. "We camp here," Begay announced. "The tomb is in there." He pointed toward the dark slab of the mesa. The place had a palpable wrongness to it. The usual desert sounds, the buzz of insects, the cry of a distant hawk, were absent. There was only the low moan of the wind as it funneled through the canyon. As we set up our tents, I watched our two hired hands. Their boisterous energy had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, nervous silence. They kept glancing up at the black mesa as if expecting to see something looking back. As the sun began to set, the sky took on a bruised, purplish hue. There was no gentle transition, just a swift and sudden fall of darkness. With it came a change in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped, and a strange electrical charge filled the air. On the horizon, clouds began to boil, dark and menacing. A storm was coming, one that had appeared from nowhere. The first gust of wind hit us like a physical blow, whipping sand into our faces and threatening to tear the tents from their moorings. Then the lightning started, not in distant flashes, but in furious, violent spears that stabbed the earth all around us. The thunder was instantaneous, a deafening crack that shook the very ground we stood on. It was a storm of unnatural ferocity. I was struggling to secure a flapping tent line when a bolt of lightning struck the top of the mesa, illuminating it for a fraction of a second in a stark, actinic glare. And in that frozen moment, I saw it. Or I thought I saw it. A figure, standing at the very edge of the precipice. It was silhouetted against the flash, gaunt and impossibly tall. It had the shape of a man, but it was hunched, and its head was too long, its snout too pronounced. For that one blinding heartbeat of time, it looked exactly like a great, emaciated wolf standing on two legs. Then darkness crashed back in, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I yelled to Frank over the roar of the wind. "See what?" he shouted back, wrestling with a pole. "I can't see a damn thing in this monsoon." I shook my head, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a trick of the light. A Rorschach test of lightning and shadow on a rock formation. My mind, primed by the workers' stories and the oppressive atmosphere, was playing tricks on me. I was a scientist. I dealt in facts, in evidence that could be measured and catalogued. And yet I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The gaunt, watchful silhouette, poised on the edge of the dark mesa, waiting patiently as the storm raged below. I told myself it was fatigue. I told myself it was my imagination. But a cold, primal part of my brain whispered a different, more terrifying truth. It had seen us. The storm vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a sky unnervingly clear and studded with cold, distant stars. The morning broke crisp and clean, the air washed of dust, but the oppressive atmosphere of the place remained. At the base of the black mesa, where Begay directed us to begin, the rock was sheer and smooth, as if it had been sliced by a giant's knife. For 3 days, we toiled under the Arizona sun. The two hired hands, their initial bravado long gone, worked with a grim, resentful energy. We cleared away centuries of accumulated rockfall and sand from the base of the cliff face, expecting to find the lintel of a hidden entrance, or at least a seam that suggested a sealed passageway. Frank was relentless, driving us on, his conviction unshaken. "It's here," he'd grunt, his face caked with dust and sweat. "It has to be." On the fourth day, our shovels scraped against something flat and unyielding. With mounting excitement, we cleared the remaining debris. What we uncovered was not a door, but an impossibility. It was a massive, rectangular slab of polished black stone, obsidian or something like it, set perfectly flush into the cliff face. It was perhaps 12 feet high and 8 feet wide. There were no seams, no cracks, no hinges, no handle. It was a perfect, unbroken surface, a sheet of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light. We ran our hands over it. It was unnervingly smooth and cool to the touch despite the blazing sun. We pushed, we pried, we hammered at its edges with a geological pick. The stone didn't even chip. It was as if the mesa had been grown around this single, perfect, impenetrable piece of geometry. The days that followed were a slow descent into frustration. We tried everything. We examined the slab with magnifying glasses, looking for any sign of a mechanism. We poured water over it, hoping to reveal a hidden crack. We tapped its entire surface with a hammer, listening for any change in resonance that might indicate a hollow space behind it. Nothing. The monolith remained impassive, silent, and mocking. Frank's temper, already frayed, began to disintegrate.
"This is a joke!"
he roared one evening, throwing his pick down in a cloud of red dust. "That son of a bitch Begay brought us out here on a wild goose chase. He's probably halfway to Mexico with our $2,500. But Joseph Begay hadn't left. He spent his days sitting on a rock, outcropping a few hundred yards away, watching us. He never offered advice, never helped with the digging. He just watched, his dark eyes following our every futile movement. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, no hint of a con man enjoying his ruse. There was only that same unnerving reptilian patience. He was waiting for something. My own rational mind was struggling to find a foothold. Perhaps it was a natural geological formation, a freak occurrence of obsidian. But it was too perfect, its placement too deliberate. It was a door. It had to be a door. But one built with a technology, a skill, that the ancient peoples of this land simply should not have possessed. The mood in our small camp soured completely. The two hired hands grew more and more restless, muttering to themselves and casting fearful glances at Begay. Eleanor, for her part, had stopped participating in the physical labor. She would spend hours just sitting and looking at the monolith, her sketchbook in her lap, her expression one of deep, troubled concentration. On the 8th day, as the rest of us slumped in exhausted defeat, she finally spoke. "We're thinking about this all wrong," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still air. "We're trying to solve the problem of how to get in." Frank snorted. "What other problem is there, Eleanor?" Her gaze was fixed on the black stone. "We assume this door was built by the people outside to protect what was inside. A lock to keep thieves out of a treasure room." She looked at us, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible idea. But what if it wasn't built by the people outside at all? What if it was built to last forever, not to keep us from getting in? Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But to keep whatever is in there from getting out?" A profound silence fell over our group. The wind moaned through the canyon, and suddenly her words seemed to hang in the air, imbued with an undeniable, horrifying logic. the perfect, seamless construction, the lack of any external mechanism. It wasn't a lock. It was a seal, a cage door constructed from the inside. We all turned to look at Joseph Begay. He was watching us, and for the first time, a slow, thin smile spread across his lips. It was a smile of grim satisfaction, the look of a man who had been waiting a very long time for his students to finally grasp the true and terrible nature of the lesson. He knew we couldn't open it. He also knew that something else could, and he was willing to wait. Our morale was shattered. Frank had lapsed into a sullen, defeated silence. The hired hands had all but quit, doing the bare minimum to earn their pay, their fear of Begay the only thing keeping them from deserting. I spent my time re-examining our maps and notes, trying to find a logical error, a piece of the puzzle we had missed. We were on the verge of admitting defeat, of packing up our camp and slinking back to civilization with a story of a con man and a strange slab of rock. We had decided to give it one more day. That day was the summer solstice. We didn't realize it at first. The days had blurred into a monotonous cycle of heat and failure. But as the afternoon wore on, I noticed the sun's path seemed different, its arc across the sky reaching its absolute zenith. It was Eleanor who made the connection. "The solstice," she breathed, looking from the sun to the dark mesa. So many of the ancient cultures oriented their structures to the solstices and equinoxes. Chaco, Cahokia. What if? It was a slim hope, but it was the only one we had. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, we gathered before the monolith. Begay, for the first time, left his perch and came to stand with us, his presence a heavy, unspoken weight. The air grew still, the shadows of the canyon walls stretching like long skeletal fingers across the valley floor. The sun dipped below the rim of the opposite canyon, and for a few minutes, the mesa was cast in deep shadow. We thought we had been wrong. Frank let out a sigh of disgust, turning to leave. "That's it," he muttered. "I'm done." "Wait," Eleanor said, her voice tight with anticipation. And then it happened. A single final beam of sunlight, channeled through a narrow notch in the far canyon wall, lanced across the gloom. It struck the black monolith not as a broad wash of light, but as a precise, focused ray, as if from a celestial spotlight. And where it touched the stone, something incredible occurred. The obsidian surface, which had been a void of perfect black, began to glow with a faint, internal, reddish light. Faint lines appeared, burning like hot embers just beneath the surface. My heart hammered in my chest. They were the same pictographs from the clay tablet. The screaming man with twisted limbs, the serrated jawbone, and in the center, the predatory inward coiling spiral. The key wasn't a physical object. It was a moment in time, a confluence of light and season. "My God," I whispered. Eleanor was already working, her hands flying across her sketchbook, frantically copying the symbols as they glowed brighter. "It's a complete text," she said, her voice a mixture of academic triumph and pure dread. The tablet was just a fragment, a warning sign. This is the whole inscription. "What does it say?" Frank asked, his defeat forgotten, his face alight with a greedy, feverish excitement. She translated as she sketched, her voice trembling slightly. "Beneath this stone sleeps the one who walks in two skins, a sorcerer of the first people, who turned on his own kind. He traded his soul for a life that does not end, and gained a hunger that cannot be filled." Her pencil paused. She looked up at us, her face pale in the dying light. "It ends with a warning. Do not wake the hunger that outlasted the sun. The final beam of light was now fading. The glyphs began to dim, the red embers sinking back into the blackness of the stone. A primal instinct screamed at me to step back, to let the door remain sealed, to heed the desperate warning of the ancients. But I was a man of science, a man driven by the need to know, to see, to understand. And Frank was standing beside me, his eyes wide, whispering, "Open it, Arthur. Open it." Mesmerized, I reached out and placed my hand on the central spiral symbol, just as the last of the light vanished. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low, grinding vibration started deep within the stone, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. It was the sound of something ancient and impossibly heavy being moved for the first time in centuries. With a deafening shriek of stone on stone, the entire obsidian slab began to retract into the cliff face, revealing a maw of perfect, silent darkness. The air that wafted out was not stale or dusty. It was cold. A deep, unnatural cold, carrying a faint, cloying scent of dried meat and old blood. We stood at the precipice of discovery, the dream of every archaeologist. But standing there, peering into that silent, waiting dark, I was not filled with triumph. I was filled with a soul-deep, sickening dread. We had ignored every warning, and we had just turned the key. The darkness in the doorway was absolute, a solid wall of black that seemed to absorb the light from our powerful battery-powered lanterns. Armed with the lamps and a growing sense of trepidation, the three of us, Frank, Eleanor, and I, prepared to descend. Begay remained outside, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He had brought us to the door. The rest, it seemed, was up to us. The two hired hands huddled by the jeep, refusing to come any closer. Stone steps, slick with a strange, faint dampness, led down into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of decay and something else, something wild and musky like a predator's den, growing stronger. Our lantern beams cut sharp cones through the gloom, revealing walls that were not bare rock. They were covered in frescoes, painted in visceral shades of ochre, charcoal, and a terrifyingly vivid crimson that could only have been blood. They were horrific. Unlike the peaceful hunting and harvesting scenes of other Puebloan art, these murals depicted scenes of ritualistic carnage and unholy transformation. We saw figures of men, their faces contorted in agony, being dismembered on stone altars. We saw another series of images that showed a shaman-like figure wearing the pelt of a wolf, then slowly, panel by panel, merging with it. His limbs elongating, his teeth sharpening, until the final image was of a monstrous man-like beast standing over a pile of human bones. It was a step-by-step guide to an atrocity.
My God,
Eleanor whispered, her hand covering her mouth. This isn't a tomb for a king. It's a temple for a monster. Frank, however, was energized, his fear burned away by the sheer, unprecedented nature of the find. "This is it," he boomed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "A cult. A death cult that history completely missed. This rewrites everything we know about them." The steps opened into a large, circular chamber. In the center of the room, on a low stone dais, stood a sarcophagus. But it was the objects arranged around it that made us stop in our tracks. This was no treasure of gold or jewels. It was something far stranger, far more valuable to an anthropologist. There were magnificent ceremonial robes made from the iridescent black feathers of ravens and the brilliant blue plumage of birds I couldn't identify, species that shouldn't have existed in this part of the world. There were obsidian knives with edges so fine they seemed to disappear into the air, and spearheads carved with terrifying precision. Ornate jewelry lay on stone pedestals, not simple turquoise and shell, but intricate designs of silver and a strange, pale, unidentifiable bone, crafted with a metallurgical skill that was centuries ahead of its time. "This is impossible," I breathed, running my light over a breastplate of woven silver and turquoise. They were a Neolithic culture. They didn't have this level of metalworking. This shouldn't be here. Our attention was finally drawn to the sarcophagus in the center of the room. It was carved from a single block of pale veined sandstone, its lid held in place by its own immense weight. There were no carvings on its surface. It was stark, simple, and foreboding. It took all our combined strength, using pry bars from our kit, to shift the massive lid. It moved with a grating screech that scraped at our nerves, releasing a puff of desiccated, foul-smelling air. We shone our 3 beams of light inside. My first thought was that it was not human. The body within was mummified by the dry air, its skin a dark, leathery brown stretched taut over a grotesque frame. But the frame was wrong. The arms and legs were too long, the proportions subtly but disturbingly incorrect, like a human figure seen in a warped mirror. The rib cage was deep and narrow, more like a dog's than a man's, but the head was the worst part. The cranium was elongated, and the jaw was massive, jutting forward in a permanent bestial prognathism. And the teeth. The lips had shriveled back to reveal a full set of long, sharp, needle-like points, more like the fangs of a canine predator than the teeth of a human being. A few wisps of coarse black hair still clung to the scalp. "Incredible," Frank whispered, his voice filled with scientific awe rather than horror. "Some kind of extreme genetic abnormality. Proteus syndrome, perhaps, or something we've never documented. A chieftain, born with these deformities, revered as a god or a spirit. That's why he was buried like this. This is the find of a lifetime." He leaned in closer, his excitement overriding all caution. But I couldn't share his academic detachment. I felt a deep, instinctual revulsion. My scientific mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing through the lens of pathology and genetics, as Frank was. But another, older part of my brain was screaming. It wasn't looking at the remains of a man with a rare birth defect. It was looking at something that had been born a man, but had not died as one. It was looking at a cage. And we had just found the body of the monster that had been locked inside. The discovery of a lifetime demanded immediate action. Leaving the tomb, we were blinking in the sunlight like creatures born of the dark. Frank was a whirlwind of energy, barking orders into the radio handset, contacting the nearest county sheriff's office in Kayenta to report a major archaeological find and request a guard to secure the site from looters. He was emphatic about its importance, but deliberately vague about the abnormalities of the occupant. An undisturbed high-status burial was how he phrased it. A skeptical but duty-bound Sheriff Thompson and 2 of his deputies arrived by late afternoon, their patrol car struggling over the rough terrain. They looked at the monolith, the dark opening, and then at us, their faces a mixture of disbelief and professional weariness. Frank, puffed up with pride, led the sheriff inside. He returned a few minutes later, the lawman looking pale and shaken. A temporary camp was established, a perimeter set. We were official. The find was real. The first 24 hours were a blur of documentation. We photographed every artifact, every inch of the frescoes, every grotesque angle of the mummy. I spent hours sketching the creature in the sarcophagus, my hand moving with clinical precision, but my mind reeling. It was on the second day that I noticed the first impossibility. I was in the tomb, taking close-up shots of the mummy's hands, when I paused. Something was different. I couldn't place it at first. I flicked back through the previous day's photographs. Yes, there it was. The skin on the mummy's elongated fingers had been like ancient parchment, wrinkled and brittle, clinging tightly to the bone. Now, it seemed fuller. The deep wrinkles were shallower. The color was subtly less brown, with an almost imperceptible grayish undertone. It looked less like something that had been dead for 1,000 years and more like something that had been dead for a month. "Frank, come look at this," I called, my voice hushed. He came down the steps, annoyed at the interruption. I explained my observation, pointing from the photograph to the body. He squinted, shone his flashlight on it, and then snorted. "It's the humidity, Arthur," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "We opened the seal. The air from outside is getting in. The tissue is rehydrating slightly. It's a common phenomenon. Don't get spooked." He was probably right. It was a rational, scientific explanation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the box was changing. That night, the real strangeness began. The two deputies had brought a pair of German shepherds with them, trained patrol dogs that had been restlessly whining and growling at the entrance to the tomb ever since they arrived. In the middle of the night, a frantic barking erupted from the camp, followed by a sharp yelp and then silence. In the morning, both dogs were gone. Sheriff Thompson organized a search. One of his deputies found them an hour later, tucked under a thorny creosote bush about 100 yards from camp. What was left of them? There were no bite marks, no torn flesh. They were just empty. Their bodies were intact, but they were flat, desiccated, their fur clinging to what felt like hollow shells of bone and hide. All the blood, all the moisture, had been drained from them, leaving behind a pair of grotesque, weightless husks. "Mountain lion," the sheriff declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "A big one. Must have scared it off before it could feed properly." He looked uneasily at the dark maw of the tomb. Or maybe a snake. A whole nest of them. None of it made sense. While the men were searching, Eleanor, who had been growing more withdrawn and anxious, took a walk in the opposite direction, toward a cluster of flat rocks at the base of the canyon. She came back an hour later, her face ashen. She beckoned for me to follow her, saying nothing until we were far from the others. She led me to a large, flat-topped sandstone boulder. The surface was covered in fresh scratches, deep gouges that had been carved into the rock with incredible force. And in the center of the stone was a dark, sticky stain of what was clearly dried blood. Arranged in a neat circle around the boulder were the bodies of a dozen small desert animals: coyotes, jackrabbits, a Gila monster. They were in the same condition as the dogs, perfectly intact but utterly dry, their small bodies as light and brittle as autumn leaves. "Someone, or something, is performing rituals here," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "Sacrifices. It's feeding. It's getting stronger." Her words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Frank's humidity theory evaporated from my mind. The creature in the tomb wasn't just passively absorbing moisture from the air. Something was actively nourishing it. I looked from the desiccated animals to the dark opening of the tomb. It wasn't a body rehydrating. It was a battery, slowly, deliberately being recharged. And I had a sickening feeling that we were about to find out what it was being charged for. The tension in our small, isolated camp became a living thing, as tangible as the oppressive heat. Sleep offered little escape. Frank and I were plagued by the same nightly disturbance, a faint, dry whispering that seemed to slither into our tent from the tomb's entrance. It was a language we didn't recognize, sibilant and guttural like the sound of sand scraping against bone. It would weave in and out of our dreams, leaving us exhausted and on edge by morning. The strangest part was that only we seemed to hear it. Eleanor, sleeping in the adjacent tent, heard nothing. Her anxiety manifested differently. She became obsessed with her translations of the tomb's frescoes, working late into the night by lantern light, convinced she had missed a crucial detail, a key to understanding what we had unleashed. The sheriff and his men just grew surlier, their city-bred nerves frayed by the unsettling silence and the unexplained loss of their dogs. On the third day after the tomb was opened, the sky began to sicken. The brilliant empty blue was slowly curdled by a yellowish-brown haze that crept in from the southern horizon. It wasn't cloud, it was dust. "Haboob?" Sheriff Thompson grunted, shielding his eyes as he stared south. "A big one. We'd better batten down the hatches. This is going to be nasty." A frantic energy seized the camp. We rushed to secure the tents, anchor the equipment, and move our precious notes and cameras into the relative safety of the Jeep. The wind began to pick up, not in gusts, but as a steady, massive pressure that made the air hard to breathe. The sun was blotted out, and the world was plunged into a surreal, orange twilight. The horizon was gone, replaced by a solid, churning wall of sand 1,000 feet high, moving toward us with terrifying speed. Just as the first grit-filled tendrils of the storm lashed at our faces, a scream tore through the rising howl of the wind. It was a sound of pure, undiluted terror. It was Eleanor. I turned to see her stumbling out of the tomb's entrance, her face a mask of horror, her eyes wide and staring. "It moved!" she shrieked, pointing back into the darkness. "I saw it. Its finger. It moved." She was in a full-blown panic, scrambling for her pack for the keys to her car. "We have to leave. We have to leave now." But it was too late. The haboob hit us like a solid object. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of roaring wind and blinding, stinging sand. Visibility dropped to 0. I was thrown to my knees, shielding my face with my arms. The noise was apocalyptic, a deafening shriek that drowned out everything else. And in that chaos, the true horror began. Through the roar of the wind, I heard another scream, this one from one of the deputies. It was sharp, full of agony, and it was cut off with a sickening wet crunch. A gunshot blasted nearby, the muzzle flash a brief, useless flower in the swirling brown murk. Then another. Panic and confusion reigned. We were blind, deafened, and being hunted. I saw a shape move through the dust, a thing of impossible speed and gaunt angles. It was tall, hunched and dark. It lunged toward the source of the last gunshot. There was another choked-off cry. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was just the storm, just panic, just shadows. But I knew what I was seeing. The hunger was awake. Something slammed into the side of my head, and the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. I crumpled to the ground, my ears ringing. As my vision swam back into focus, I saw Joseph Begay standing over me, a heavy rock in his hand. He then turned and struck Frank, who was trying to rise nearby. Through the swirling sand, I saw Begay's old Ford pickup. The two hired hands, his accomplices all along, were frantically loading the most valuable artifacts from the tomb. The feathered cloaks, the obsidian weapons, the silver breastplate, into the truck bed. Bigay dragged my semi-conscious form and Frank's limp body toward the tomb entrance, his strength unnatural. He propped us up like discarded dolls. He leaned in close, his face a mask of ecstatic madness, his voice cutting through the storm's fury. "Fools! You thought this was about money? About history?" He spat, his eyes wild. "This is about purification. He has been sleeping for 1,000 years, weakened by their seal. But now he is awake. Your blasphemous presence, your greed, it was the final offering he needed." He gestured to the chaos around us. "His hunger will cleanse this land of you outsiders, of all who have forgotten the old ways. He will make the world clean again." With a final triumphant yell, he turned and ran toward his truck. He scrambled into the driver's seat and with a roar of the engine plunged into the heart of the sandstorm, taking the treasures, the talismans of the creature's power, with him. He left us there, wounded and disoriented, as offerings for the newly awakened God he had just set free. The world came back to me in a wave of pain and the grinding roar of the wind. My head throbbed, and the coppery taste of blood filled my mouth. Through the thick, choking dust, I saw a scene from a nightmare. The storm was a living entity, and within it, the monster moved. Sheriff Thompson was firing his revolver, the shots sounding like feeble pops against the gale. The creature, the Yi-Nald Lushi, was a blur of elongated limbs and unnatural speed. It didn't seem to mind the sand or the wind. It closed the distance in 2 impossible strides, and its long, clawed hand swiped across the sheriff's chest. The man fell without a sound. Nearby, Frank was groaning, trying to push himself up. His left arm was bent at a sickening angle, the bone clearly shattered. His face was a mask of agony and disbelief. "Arthur," he gasped, "what is that thing?" The creature turned its head toward us. In the swirling ochre gloom, I saw its face. The leathery, mummified skin was now supple and gray. Its eyes glowed with a faint predatory phosphorescence. It took a step in our direction, its movements a horrifying fusion of human bipedalism and canine agility. It was coming to finish its meal. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through my pain. There was no fighting that thing. There was only flight. But where? The canyon was a death trap. Then I remembered. On the survey maps, a small seasonal river, the Little San Juan, ran along the bottom of the canyon, about 100 feet below the mesa. It was our only chance. "Frank, we have to move, now!" I yelled over the storm. I grabbed him by his good arm, hauling him to his feet. He cried out in pain but stumbled along with me. We half ran, half fell toward the canyon's edge, away from the tomb, away from the monster. Behind us I heard a low, guttural snarl that was not of this earth. It was toying with us. The lip of the canyon was a steep, treacherous slope of scree and loose rock. Below, barely visible through the dust, was the dark ribbon of water. It wasn't a gentle river. It was a churning, muddy torrent, swollen by the recent storm. "We have to jump," I said, my voice hoarse. Frank looked at me, his eyes wide with terror, then back at the shape that was now loping toward us, closing the distance with terrifying ease. "We'll be killed on the rocks. We'll be killed if we stay." The creature was almost upon us. It reared up to its full, unnatural height, its long jaw opening in a silent, hungry snarl. There was no more time. I shoved Frank forward and threw myself after him. The fall was a chaotic tumble of scraping rock and tearing fabric. We hit the water with a violent, bone-jarring impact. The cold was a shocking slap to the system, stealing my breath. The current immediately seized us, a powerful, indifferent force that dragged us under and away. I broke the surface, gasping, and saw the monster standing on the cliff's edge above, a stick-thin silhouette against the raging brown sky. It watched us go, its head tilted as if in curiosity, before the storm and a bend in the river snatched the image away. They found us 2 days later and 5 miles downstream. A pair of Navajo shepherds found us washed up on a sandbar, more dead than alive. I was concussed and suffering from exposure. Frank's arm was mangled and he was delirious with a raging fever. Our story, when we were coherent enough to tell it, was dismissed as the ravings of traumatized men. The official report was tragically simple. A freak, violent sandstorm had hit the unsanctioned archaeological site. The resulting panic and disorientation led to the deaths of Sheriff Thompson and his 2 deputies. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, it was presumed, had tried to flee in her vehicle and had gotten lost in the storm. Her car was found weeks later, half buried in a dune, but her body was never recovered. The locals whispered that the land had simply taken her. The official cause of the deputies' deaths was listed as animal attack, perpetrated by a large, unidentified predator, likely a cougar or even a transient black bear, driven into a frenzy by the storm. Of course, they found no trace of the tomb. The haboob had done its work, burying the entrance under tons of rock and sand. The monolith and the empty sarcophagus behind it were gone, as if they had never been. There was no sign of Joseph Begay, his truck, or the priceless, terrible artifacts he had stolen. Frank and I left Arizona as soon as he was stable enough to travel. Our careers were in ruins, our reputations tarnished by a disastrous expedition that ended in tragedy and a story no sane academic would ever believe. The university quietly shelved the project. Frank rarely speaks of it now. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I see him staring out the window, his good hand rubbing his ruined arm, and I know he is remembering the impossible thing that moved in the dust. I know the truth. I know that the scientific paper I was meant to write is a lie, and the real story is a scream in the dark. Somewhere out there, in the sprawling, forgotten corners of America, Joseph Begay is traveling with his holy relics, and with him travels an ancient, patient hunger, now freed from its stone prison. A hunger that outlasted the sun once before, a hunger that is now loose in the world, awake and learning its new home, and it is very, very hungry.